Hi, I wanted to talk about acclimatization versus adaptation. These are two concepts which people tend to misunderstand a lot in introductory biology, and to be honest, I misunderstood them a lot too for years. And later on, when I learned more about physiology, anatomy, psychology, and other subjects, it came much more clear to me that there's a bigger picture that actually explains acclimatization a lot better. So I'll just try and explain it quickly and see that it is a little bit more simpler for you. So when we talk about adaptation, the first thing that makes it easier to separate is adaptation is like you're thinking about genetics. So imagine you have like a population, right? And you have a group of this population. Let's say we take, how about this? Let's say we take a bunch of people inside New York City. Every single resident inside New York City, we look at them for like I guess 10 generations, and we're watching the allele frequencies change, and we're watching this population, and we isolate it, right? So no one can enter or leave New York City. Now, when we think about adaptation, when we talk about natural selection, talk about selective pressure, genetic drift, all these kind of mechanisms, you're thinking about the ability of any individual in that population to adapt over generations. So, like when we think about, like, let's say you may have heard of this example in your class, because I'm sure most courses that discuss evolution will talk about this example about Lamarck. What did Lamarck say? He said that okay, giraffes they stretch their neck, and because they kept stretching their neck to go and get food from higher branches, that explains why over time they developed that trait for the longer neck. Now, why is that not an adaptation? Is it that you can't stretch your neck and later on make it longer by getting higher branch foods? Not necessarily. But the thing is that if that were to be the case, that makes an acclimatization not an adaptation. The adaptation is when there is one part of the gene that passes on to the next generation, and that next generation inherits that gene that happens to be more successful. So let's look at one example that's really simple that everyone knows about: bacteria, right? So you have, let's say, like an antibiotic, like a vancomycin, right? And there is bacteria that happens to become resistant. How do they become resistant? Let's think about the ideas of how that could be. Do they become resistant because they decided to? No. If there was a will or there was some mental way to become resistant, again, it's acclimatization. It's not adaptation. If did they become resistant because there was more antibiotic exposed to them, so they had to um, develop the gene? Nope. And this is a very important point. A lot of professors will give you trick questions about this, and some students might get it wrong. And this is where you kind of misunderstand how adaptation and evolution works. When we're talking about evolution and genetics, you have to understand one key takeaway message that I'm going to bring home. You cannot choose the gene. That's it. This is going to make everything so much easy. It's so much more easier. So if let's say you get like a antibiotic exposed to that bacteria, right? The bacteria cannot choose the resistant gene. Let's say none of the bacteria have any antibiotic resistant genes ever. They just never have them. No individuals in that population carry it. They don't mutate it. Nothing. Now, can they ever become resistant? Hypothetically, in that situation, no, because they can't choose to have that gene. The genotype, it only changes under one condition. And what is that? It's under a mutation. Is a mutation pressured or selective, or is it chosen? Nope, it's completely random. So what happens is the mutation will be random, but those individuals which will have those random mutations that just so happen to be um, good for a certain thing in that population that may be selected for or selected against, that directs the way that the population adapts. And that's what adaptation is in a biological sense. But if we're thinking about acclimatization, remember this is strictly biological. Acclimatization, what it basically means is how the individual, don't use the word adapt because it's kind of confusing. It's not that it's wrong, but it's just in a biological sense, it can be confusing when you mix acclimatization and adaptation. Yes, when you acclimate, you are kind of getting more used to your environment, but there's an easy way to kind of understand this. So professors sometimes use this one example where they'll say, okay, a person he runs in the mountains, right? And there is the oxygen levels are really high, so their volume of oxygen that they can take into their blood increases, so they get better at handling more air, right? So that is not an adaptation, but it is an acclimatization. So then students will be like, okay, so that's great, but then like how does that explain what an acclimatization is exactly? So one, let's dissect this. There's no genetics involved in this whole change. So this is a change where genetics are not a factor whatsoever. The genetics don't change, and they aren't passed to another generation. So what I like to think about is I like to think about something called feedback loops. You'll learn about this in physiology, and you'll see it even in psychology, all kinds of systems, even in engineering, right? So when you look at a computer, there's something you input into the computer. I'm typing on my keyboard, right? And information goes into the into the computer. The computer receives the information, and then the processor, it processes the information, and then the computer thinks about it, it processes it, and it sends something back, right? And based on that, it's going to change to whatever I input, right? Now let's look at the body, right? Let's talk about temperature, right? It gets colder outside. So you ever wondered about how, like, when it gets really cold, your nose starts to run, right? So it's getting really cold outside. That information of being stimulated by the cold weather, it's received by your skin, and it goes through your neural pathway to your brain, which integrates that information. It processes it like a computer processor, and then that sends information back to your body, and there will be a physiological response for that input. So for the cold temperature, your body will increase heat. It will generate heat, and that's why your nose will run, right? So this is acclimatization. Something happens from the outside, the body responds at a physiological level, and it creates a change. That biochemical change, or that neurochemical change, or that whatever, that's not adaptation, because it's not being sent to the next generation. So if I, let's say, exercise and I keep building my muscle, I contract the muscle fibers, the information's being sent, and the muscles start to grow and grow and grow and grow. When I pass on my genes, my children will not have the same muscles that I got from lifting weights in the gym. Why? Because they didn't do it themselves. This was a process of information being sent, integrated, and sent back. So it's a physiological change. That's acclimatization. So what do I need to do that could be an adaptation? Let's think of an example together. Here's an easy one. Let's say I have brown eyes, right? And let's say for some reason, I live in some kind of population where there's a virus that happens to kill off all people that don't have brown eyes, which is, of course, it's an absurd example, but you can't predict how genetics interplays with survival. These traits fitness is just completely like random. So let's say that happened. That means that brown eyes would become beneficial for that population. So the future generations which receive that hereditary, that variation, they inherit it, and that next generation and the generation after and the generation after, they have a biological adaptation which makes them physically fit. Biologically fit. Excuse my language. So that's basically the difference between adaptation and acclimatization. And if it kind of confuses you, it's important to go back and understand what biological fitness means. In a nutshell, it's the individual of the population which lives long enough to reproduce and pass off their genetic material. And I can explain it in more detail in another video, but I just hope this helps with those two things.